A low, guttural hum vibrates through the air, followed by a crackling burst of energy. Ethan Carter sprints across the jagged terrain, his boots crunching against the coarse, ash-covered ground. Above him, the twin suns scorch the sky, their heat bouncing off shattered metal spires, remnants of a once thriving human outpost. Ethan's breath comes in sharp, labored bursts, sweat streaking his dirt-smudged face as he dives behind a crumbled wall just as a pulse of blue plasma tears through the air where he'd stood moments before. He peeks over the edge, eyes narrowing at the distant figures moving with predatory precision. The Gorith. Their towering forms glint under the sunlight, sleek black armor blending with the shadowy crags of the landscape. Their movements are deliberate, their glowing orange visors scanning the ruins for him. Ethan knows they don't miss often. His hand tightens around the grip of a battered plasma pistol. A quick inventory runs through his mind, 3 shots left. Useless against their armor unless he hits a vulnerable spot. A flicker of determination crosses his face. He's been here before, outgunned, outnumbered. He's still alive. They're getting closer. Ethan forces himself to move, darting toward a narrow crevice, his shoulders brushing jagged edges of rock. His heartbeat pounds in his ears, drowning out the hunter's distant footfalls. As he slips further into the canyon, his mind races. This is how it's been for years, running, hiding, surviving. Ever since Earth fell, the Gorith have been hunting his kind. A calculated extermination. Humanity's ingenuity had made them a threat too dangerous to coexist with, or so the Gorith believed. Ethan had seen the last transmission from Earth. Cities reduced to cinders, oceans boiling, the screams of millions snuffed out in an instant. The survivors, those lucky or unlucky enough to escape, scattered across the stars. But even among them, Ethan's survival was nothing short of a miracle. He wasn't the strongest or the smartest. What set him apart was his unyielding refusal to give up. He'd endured near starvation, endless betrayal, and the ever-present shadow of death. He pauses to catch his breath, leaning against the rough wall of the canyon. His fingers trace the edges of a small charm hanging from his neck, a fragment of a photo, burned at the edges but still showing the smiling faces of a woman and a child. The ache in his chest flares, a reminder of what he'd lost, and of what he still had to fight for. The faint whirring sound of a machine pulls him out of his thoughts. His eyes snap to a small drone hovering nearby, its sleek surface gleaming with alien tech. He curses under his breath and lunges at it, grabbing it with both hands. The drone's sensors flash red as it struggles against his grip, emitting a high-pitched alarm. "Damn it!" Ethan mutters, slamming it against the wall until it cracks open, its innards sparking. He digs through the exposed components and finds the transmitter, a blinking chip broadcasting his location. A sinking realization hits him. The Gorith are closer than he thought. In the distance, the guttural roars of the hunters grow louder. Ethan tosses the broken drone aside and runs, his mind spinning. Someone had to have placed that drone. Was it a trap? Had one of his few remaining allies betrayed him? There's no time to dwell on it. Every step he takes feels heavier, the weight of survival pressing down on him. His legs burn, and his injuries, scars that never healed right, flare with pain. But he doesn't stop. He can't. Ahead, the canyon narrows into a dead end. Ethan skids to a halt, eyes darting for an escape route. The only way forward is through a jagged gap in the rock face, barely wide enough to squeeze through. He presses himself into the crevice, scraping his shoulders against sharp edges. The roar of the Gorith fills the canyon behind him, followed by the ominous clink of metal boots on stone. They're closing in, their voices guttural and low as they communicate in their alien tongue. Ethan emerges on the other side, his breath hitching at the sight of what lies before him. A cavernous expanse stretches out, its walls shimmering faintly with bioluminescent moss. In the center, a cluster of ancient human tech lies scattered, rusted weapons, broken machinery, and something else. A faint blue glow catches his eye. Hope stirs, but the footsteps behind him snap him back to the present. The Gorith are relentless, their hunting instincts sharpened over centuries. Ethan moves toward the glowing object, determination etched into his features. Whatever it is, it might be his last chance. Vrak stood at the edge of the ravine, his tall, muscular frame silhouetted against the blood-red light of the setting suns. His orange visor pulsed faintly, scanning the chaos below. The broken remnants of human engineering and the faint scorch marks left by plasma fire spoke volumes. Ethan Carter had been here. And once again, the human had evaded capture. Vrak's clawed hand flexed instinctively, the cool metal of his gauntlet creaking under the strain. His team, hardened warriors bred for the hunt, flanked him silently, their breathing deep and steady. They awaited his orders, their discipline unshakable. But this wasn't just another hunt. It wasn't even about the human anymore. It was about him. Ethan Carter wasn't the strongest prey Vrak had ever hunted. Nor the fastest. But the human's mind, that frustratingly unpredictable, endlessly resourceful mind, had turned this into a challenge like no other. Vrak respected him for it, even as he yearned to end the hunt. It wasn't just the Gortha's honor at stake, it was his own. His people had long viewed humans as vermin. Clever, yes. Dangerous, certainly. But vermin nonetheless. When the first human colonies clashed with the Gorth Empire, the humans' ingenuity caught them off guard, costing the Gorth dearly. That ingenuity was why the humans had to be wiped out. Not out of hatred, but necessity. A race so adaptive, so quick to learn, was a threat that couldn't be allowed to survive. And yet here, in the midst of the ashes of their civilization, one of them still persisted. Vrak turned to his second-in-command, his voice calm but commanding. He moves toward the canyon. Ready the drones. We will box him in. He felt the familiar surge of adrenaline as his warriors snapped into action. The hunt was far from over. Deep in the winding tunnels of the abandoned bunker, Ethan moved quickly but deliberately. His flashlight cast narrow beams of light across the walls, revealing faded human markings and broken machinery that had long since fallen into disrepair. His breath was steady now. The initial panic of the chase had subsided, replaced by the clarity of purpose. He'd been in situations like this before, cornered by the Gorth with no clear way out. Each time, he had survived, not because he was lucky, but because he thought like them. Reaching an old command station, Ethan set his pack down and began rifling through its contents. He pulled out a small toolkit and a battered data pad, connecting it to the console. The screen flickered to life, dim but functional. As the system booted up, Ethan's mind wandered back to previous hunts. The scars on his body weren't just reminders of close calls, they were lessons. Every trap he'd set, every tactic he'd used, had been born from necessity. He'd learned how to turn his enemy's strength against them, exploiting their arrogance and overconfidence. This time would be no different. His fingers flew across the console, pulling up schematics of the bunker. The tunnels were a labyrinth, designed during the war to confuse intruders. Perfect. He'd lure the Gorth in, isolate them, and strike from the shadows. If he was going down, he'd take as many of them with him as he could. The system beeped, alerting him to a cache of dormant turrets still wired into the bunker's infrastructure. Ethan grinned. If he could reroute power from the emergency generators, he'd have a fighting chance. He worked quickly, sweat dripping down his brow as he rewired circuits and patched into the turret systems. The faint hum of energy coursing through the wires brought a flicker of hope. The Gorth were relentless, but they weren't invincible. As he finished setting the final trap, a distant noise caught his attention. It wasn't the rhythmic clink of Gorth boots or the hum of their drones. It was something else. Cautiously, Ethan followed the sound, his pistol drawn. It led him deeper into the bunker, where the air grew colder and the shadows thicker. At the end of a narrow corridor, he found a room illuminated by a faint blue glow. In the center of the room, a cylindrical device pulsed gently, its surface etched with the insignia of the Old Earth Defense Corps. Ethan approached slowly, his weapon raised. The device hummed, and a soft, synthetic voice broke the silence. Human presence detected. Identifying. Subject Ethan Carter. Status: last registered survivor. Ethan froze. What are you? The voice softened, almost hesitant. I am Astra, a Level 4 autonomous intelligence unit, developed during the final stages of the war. My primary function is to preserve critical data and assist authorized personnel. Ethan lowered his weapon slightly, his mind racing. Critical data? What kind of data? Astra hesitated before responding. The coordinates of humanity's last refuge. A colony established before the fall of Earth. My systems were deactivated before I could deliver the information. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. Humanity's last refuge. For years he'd clung to the hope that somewhere, somehow, other humans had survived. But to hear it confirmed, it was overwhelming. What do you need to activate fully? He asked, already calculating how to use this to his advantage. A secure encryption key, Astra replied. Without it, I can only provide limited assistance. The key may still exist in this bunker. Ethan nodded, his resolve hardening. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for the chance to reunite with what remained of his people. For the chance to give humanity a future. As the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the tunnels, Ethan turned back toward the room's entrance. Stay quiet, he whispered to Astra. I've got work to do. The metallic clang of boots reverberated through the bunker's entrance, the sound growing louder as the Gorath breached the threshold. Vrak led the pack, his visor illuminating the dimly lit tunnel ahead. His sharp eyes scanned every shadow, every crevice, his senses heightened. The human was near, he could feel it. Behind him, his warriors moved with precision, their rifles raised and ready. The Gorath had encountered many humans before, but none had lasted this long. None had made it this personal. Vrak's admiration for Ethan burned quietly beneath the surface, but it was tempered by the cold determination to finish the hunt. A sharp flicker of light drew his attention to a corner of the corridor. A camera, barely operational, swiveled toward him. He let out a low growl. Ethan was watching. Good. Let him see what was coming. Deeper within the bunker, Ethan stared at the grainy feed on a salvaged monitor. He had rewired the surveillance system, granting him a partial view of the labyrinthine tunnels. The Gorath moved like a pack of wolves, disciplined and methodical, but he had the advantage of knowing the terrain. His fingers hovered over the controls, and he pressed a button. A section of the feed went dark. Perfect. The Gorath wouldn't know what hit them. In the silence, Ethan whispered to himself. You wanted me? Come and get me. The first trap sprung as the Gorath turned a corner. A sudden explosion rocked the tunnel, sending a cloud of dust and debris cascading around them. One of Vrak's soldiers stumbled, his armor scorched by the blast. Vrak barked a sharp command, and the others regrouped, scanning for further threats. In another part of the bunker, Ethan moved quickly, activating a series of barricades to funnel the Gorath into a specific path. The makeshift traps he'd set, sharpened metal shards rigged to tripwires, explosive charges hidden in debris, weren't meant to kill them outright. They were meant to unnerve them, to make them second-guess every step. Astra's voice echoed softly in his earpiece. 2 hostiles neutralized. Redirecting power to Section C3 for environmental control. Good, Ethan muttered. Keep them guessing. He crept through the tunnels, using his knowledge of the layout to stay one step ahead. At one point, he doubled back and ambushed a lone Gorath, disabling him with a precise shot to a weak joint in his armor. The alien crumpled, and Ethan dragged the body into the shadows, ensuring the others wouldn't find it immediately. Another trap triggered, a section of the tunnel collapsed behind Vrak's group, cutting off their escape route. Dust and rubble filled the air, and Vrak's visor automatically adjusted to the reduced visibility. He pressed forward unshaken. This was Ethan's strategy: divide and conquer. Clever, but predictable. Ethan's reliance on traps wasn't just about survival. It was psychological warfare. The Gorath prided themselves on control, on their ability to dominate any environment. Ethan's unpredictability challenged that control, forcing them to react instead of strategize. The hunters began to falter, their movements less coordinated as they encountered dead ends and ambushes. One warrior hesitated too long at a corner, only to be struck by a concealed explosive. Another stumbled into a pit Ethan had hastily dug and covered, his cries silenced by a blade Ethan wielded with brutal efficiency. But it was taking its toll. Ethan's breathing grew ragged, his limbs heavy with exhaustion. Blood seeped from a gash on his shoulder where shrapnel had grazed him during a close call. He gritted his teeth against the pain, forcing himself to keep moving. Vrak noticed the signs of wear. The traps, though effective, were becoming less sophisticated, less deliberate. Ethan was running out of resources, both physical and mental. Still, Vrak couldn't help but admire the human's resolve. Most prey succumbed quickly under the weight of Gorath precision. Ethan fought back with an almost primal defiance, his ingenuity a constant thorn in their side. It was infuriating and exhilarating. Vrak gestured for his remaining warriors to hold position. They had been lured into Ethan's game for too long. Now it was time to turn the tide. Ethan crouched behind a makeshift barricade, catching his breath. His vision blurred for a moment, the adrenaline masking but not erasing the toll on his body. He glanced at the charm around his neck, the faces etched into his memory. It wasn't just his life at stake. Astra's voice broke through his haze. Hostiles regrouping. They're adapting to the environment. Suggest immediate extraction. I'm not leaving, Ethan hissed. You cannot win this confrontation. Doesn't matter, Ethan muttered. I just need to slow them down. He forced himself to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. Every step was agony, but he pressed on, setting his final traps. He knew this fight wasn't about victory, it was about survival. About making the Gorath pay for every inch they gained. As Vrak led his team closer, he could sense Ethan's desperation. The human was formidable, but he was only delaying the inevitable. And yet, Vrak felt no satisfaction in this realization. Ethan had earned his respect, something no other prey ever had. Ethan Carter. Vrak's voice echoed through the tunnels, amplified by his helmet. You fought well. Surrender now, and I will guarantee you an honorable death. Ethan smirked bitterly at the offer, though no one was around to see it. Honorable death, he muttered to himself. Not today! He activated the final trap. A section of the tunnel collapsed behind him, sealing off the Gortha's advance. The blast sent shockwaves through the bunker, and Ethan stumbled, barely catching himself against the wall. Blood dripped steadily from his shoulder, pooling on the ground beneath him. Vrak stood on the other side of the rubble, his visor glowing in the dim light. For a moment, the two locked eyes through the debris, a mutual understanding passing between them. Ethan knew he wasn't winning. He was only buying time. But as long as he drew breath, he would fight. And Vrak, despite himself, found a small part of him hoping the human would succeed. Ethan leaned against the cold, cracked wall of the bunker, catching his breath in the eerie silence that followed the last explosion. His injuries throbbed, a dull reminder of how close he had come to death. Astra's voice broke the stillness, soft yet urgent. Ethan, I must speak with you. He frowned. This isn't exactly the best time for a chat, Astra. There may not be another opportunity. The colony, the last refuge of your kind, depends on my survival. The information stored within my core includes location data, security protocols, and the means to establish contact. Without it, they are vulnerable. The weight of her words hit him harder than any physical blow. He had clung to hope, yes, but hearing confirmation that others like him were alive? It was almost too much to process. And if the Gorath get their hands on you? He asked. The colony's location would be compromised, Astra replied. Their survival would be jeopardized. You must protect this data at all costs. Ethan closed his eyes, the enormity of his responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. Every step, every breath, was now for a future he hadn't dared to imagine. But the moment of reflection was short-lived. Footsteps echoed through the tunnels, heavy and deliberate. Vrak was coming. The Gorath leader stepped into the dimly lit chamber where Ethan stood, his imposing figure cutting through the gloom like a shadow made flesh. He didn't raise his weapon. Instead, he studied Ethan with an intensity that felt almost personal. "You've caused me no small amount of trouble, human," Vrak said, his voice calm but edged with something that felt like respect. "I underestimated your kind. That is a mistake I will not make again." Ethan squared his shoulders, ignoring the pain that flared in his side. "Yeah, well, you're not the first. Probably won't be the last, either." Vrak tilted his head slightly, his visor glinting. "Do you know why we hate you? Why we pursued your species to extinction?" Ethan didn't answer. He wasn't sure he wanted to hear it. "Adaptability," Vrak continued. "Humans are not the strongest. You are not the fastest. But your capacity to learn, to innovate, to endure, it made you a threat unlike any we had faced. In our culture, survival is sacred. You challenged that. Forced us to evolve. And for that, you had to be eradicated." The admission felt almost like a compliment, though it was laced with cold finality. "I offer you this," Vrak said. "A duel. 1-on-1. You and I. If you win, I will spare you. If you lose, you will die with honor, as a warrior should." Ethan's jaw tightened. He knew better than to trust Vrak. The Goroth weren't known for their mercy, and honor in their eyes was a concept twisted by their own self-interest. Astra's voice chimed in softly, audible only to him. "Ethan, we cannot afford to engage him directly. There is another way." "What are you thinking?" Ethan murmured under his breath. "If the bunker's primary reactor is overloaded, it would cause a catastrophic collapse," Astra said. "It would eliminate the Goroth present here and ensure my data remains secure." Ethan froze. "You're talking about blowing this whole place to hell?" "Yes," Astra replied without hesitation. "It is the only viable solution. The Goroth must not leave here with either of us." He looked at Vrak, who stood waiting for his answer, and then back at the console beside him. His mind raced. Was he really willing to sacrifice himself for a colony he'd never seen? For people who might already have moved on? But the faces of those he'd lost flashed through his mind. His family, his friends, the countless lives snuffed out by the Goroth. They hadn't given up. Neither could he. "Fine," Ethan said aloud, his voice steady. "You want a fight? You'll get one." Vrak nodded, a glint of satisfaction visible even through his helmet. "Then prepare yourself, human." As Vrak moved forward, Ethan subtly activated the console. His hands danced across the controls, initiating the reactor overload sequence Astra had described. A warning klaxon blared through the bunker, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. "What is this?" Vrak demanded, his voice rising over the din. Ethan smirked, his exhaustion briefly forgotten in the rush of adrenaline. "Insurance." The chamber trembled as the reactor began its countdown, the air growing oppressively hot. Ethan raised his weapon, aiming it squarely at Vrak. "If I'm going down, I'm taking you with me." Vrak's expression shifted, a mix of anger and something Ethan could only describe as reluctant respect. "You truly are the most dangerous prey." The fight wasn't over yet, but Ethan knew one thing for sure: the Goroth wouldn't be leaving this bunker alive. And with any luck, either would he. For humanity, for the future he'd only glimpsed in his mind's eye, it was a price worth paying. The air in the central chamber was thick with heat and tension. Sparks flew from exposed wires dangling from the ceiling, casting eerie shadows on the cracked walls. Ethan stood in the center, his breath ragged, his body screaming for rest. His left arm hung useless at his side, the gash across his shoulder oozing blood. But his eyes remained locked on Vrak, who entered with slow, deliberate steps. The Goroth leader looked every bit the predator Ethan had come to know, calm, calculated, and relentless. But there was something else in his posture now, a grudging respect that hadn't been there before. "You fought well," Vrak said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Better than most. But this ends here." Ethan didn't reply. Words wouldn't matter now. He shifted his weight subtly, drawing Vrak's attention to his uninjured side. It was a feint, one of the many tricks he had learned over years of surviving against impossible odds. Vrak lunged, his blade slicing through the air with deadly precision. Ethan ducked, the weapon missing his head by inches. He retaliated with a makeshift spear, a metal pipe he'd sharpened in the bunker's workshop. The tip grazed Vrak's armor, leaving a faint scratch. "You're slowing, human," Vrak taunted, circling Ethan like a wolf. Ethan smirked despite the pain coursing through him. "You'd be too if you'd been through what I have." The fight was brutal, each strike and counter-strike echoing through the chamber. Vrak was stronger, faster, and better equipped, but Ethan had something the Goroth leader lacked: desperation. This wasn't just about survival. It was about legacy, about ensuring the sacrifices of his people weren't in vain. Ethan spotted an opening, a slight hesitation in Vrak's stance as he prepared for another swing. Summoning every ounce of strength left in him, Ethan drove his spear upward, piercing a vulnerable joint in Vrak's armor. The Goroth staggered, his weapon clattering to the ground. Ethan stood over him, the spear poised for a final blow. But he hesitated. "Do it," Vrak growled, blood dripping from his mouth. "End it." Ethan's hand trembled, but not from weakness. He saw something in Vrak's eyes, something that reminded him of his own kind. Not the cruelty or the arrogance, but the fire, the will to survive. Slowly, he lowered the spear. "No," Ethan said. "That's not who I am." For a moment, Vrak said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then, with visible effort, he pushed himself into a sitting position. "Mercy," he muttered, almost to himself. "A weakness of your species." "Maybe," Ethan replied. "But it's what makes us human." The sound of a klaxon interrupted the moment. Astra's voice filled the chamber, calm yet urgent. "Ethan, the reactor has reached critical levels. You must evacuate immediately." Ethan turned toward the console, activating the final sequence. The walls trembled as the bunker began to collapse. He glanced back at Vrak, who remained where he was, watching him. "This place is going down," Ethan said. "You should go." Vrak didn't move. "I've lost the hunt. My fate is sealed." Ethan didn't argue. He grabbed Astra's core, a small, glowing sphere, and made his way toward the escape route. The path was unstable, sections collapsing as the reactor's countdown reached its final stages. By the time he reached the bunker's outer chamber, Ethan's injuries were catching up to him. Blood loss made his vision blur, and every step felt like dragging lead. But he couldn't stop, not now. The self-destruction sequence reached its climax as Ethan stumbled into the pod bay. He placed Astra's core into a slot on the pod's dashboard, the AI's voice immediately filling the small space. "Ethan, your vital signs are critical. Immediate medical attention is required. Just get us out of here," he muttered, collapsing into the pilot's seat. The pod's engines roared to life, and it shot out of the bunker moments before the entire structure imploded. The force of the explosion shook the pod, and Ethan winced as the shockwave rattled his battered body. But they were clear. He had made it. As the pod ascended into the sky, Ethan stared out at the horizon, the barren landscape of the planet shrinking below him. Astra's voice broke the silence. "Course plotted for the colony," she said. "Estimated time to arrival, 42 hours. Ethan let out a shaky breath, the weight of everything he'd endured pressing down on him. He reached for the charm around his neck, gripping it tightly. "They're alive," he whispered. "There's still a chance." Astra's tone softened. "Humanity's resilience is its greatest strength. You've ensured their future, Ethan." He leaned back, exhaustion finally overtaking him. Despite the pain, despite the losses, a small smile crossed his face. "Yeah," he murmured. "We're not done yet." The pod hurtled through the void, carrying with it the last embers of a species that refused to be extinguished. Ethan closed his eyes, not in defeat, but in hope. Humanity had fallen, yes. But its legacy, the will to fight, to endure, to rebuild, burned brighter than ever. And as long as he drew breath, he would carry that flame forward.